Hello, everyone. It's the 20th of May, 2024, and I'm about to do an interview with Dr. Naomi Murphy, who is a clinical and forensic psychologist and also the co host of a podcast called Locked Up Living. Naomi, thank you so much for joining me on this. And I haven't done an interview for a while, Naomi, but this is a really important one. I've been working with whistleblowers, it's a term we'll discuss, for some time. It feels very different now. It feels very positive in terms of how they are being heard in a different way. I don't think people who work in communications, I did a lot of work training corporate communications teams. I think they were a bit slow to catch up on the fact that social media is quite powerful, but it's got to be done well. So I talk about and work with people and have in the past on how to manage their own reputation online in terms of, say, tweeting or putting stuff on Facebook about their story. If they do feel they're the victim of injustice or abuse, or they've witnessed something or some kind of corruption or something going wrong at work, I show them how to do that on their own channels, but also how to work with other media organizations. So that's what I've helped recently with Telegraph. So there's a large organization called Justice for Doctors. I believe they have 150 members. And I was on one of their Zoom calls on a Wednesday evening. And it was heartbreaking. It was like a sea of pain. All these brave people who had spoken out. And, one of the people on the call, they were in a really bad place. I'm not going to say any more than that, because they'd spoken out, done what they thought was the right thing to do, because their concerns over patient safety. Sometimes people died, and they didn't know what to do, because not only were they not heard, they lost their job. They completely destroyed their reputation. And I thought they did have some contact with the media, but I just thought, well, what can I do here? I could do some training and show them how to keep the pressure up in terms of video content on Twitter and how to manage their own professional reputation. I've done this before. A lady called Jan Cruikshank, I connected her with a journalist, helped her get her video out on Twitter. She was raped by a senior colleague. Initially, she got fired. She lost her job, but we turned it around. Thanks to the media, Twitter, and a mainstream media journalist called Marcello Mega. She got a payout, £50,000 and an apology. So I was sat there on this call, Justice for Doctors, thinking, what can I do to help? And I got in touch with Gordon Rayner, associate editor of the Telegraph, and he took the story on. They invested a huge amount of time, full time. I believe they had one individual on it full time. They sent out 50 questionnaires, and they had a number of articles. And I'm just going to mention those articles and put them on the screen. And I am going to come to you, Naomi, and I'm sorry I'm going on so much. But I think this is important, because I think a lot of people think I'm the victim of abuse, injustice, or corruption, and there's nothing I can do. I'm just going to shout on Twitter over and over again because it's the truth, and I need justice, and it's obvious. I've got the evidence. But what the Telegraph did, which was very effective, is we've heard these stories before. They do get media coverage, but what the Telegraph did is they brought them all together. They spent a lot of time sending out their questionnaire to the 50. I believe there's 50 medical professionals involved who spoke out and really summarised. Got to see the pattern of behaviour by NHS bosses, how they treated them all the same. This isn't just a one-off. This was a pattern of treatment. So the articles that I think were significant, and well done to the Telegraph for doing this. NHS bosses destroy careers of whistleblowers who stand up to protect patients' lives. Talented doctors and nurses claim they have lost their jobs, with some driven to brink of suicide as bosses sought to bury their concerns. Another article: 3 whistleblowers who had their careers ruined. Medics raised their fears for patient safety, but instead found themselves at the sharp end of managers' scrutiny. Have a look at these articles, guys. Doctors are being forced to choose between patient safety and their careers. Another article by Professor Philip Banfield. This was all last week in the Telegraph. Being a whistleblower is a required part of our duty, he says. So why are we treated so terribly for doing it? And then another article again, so they've spent so much time on this, the 4-step playbook the NHS uses to break whistleblowers. Doctors who raise patient safety concerns tell how they are confronted with systemic bullying and harassment from managers and colleagues. And this article, which Gordon credited me because I passed the story on to the Telegraph, and this one, how doctors answer to Alan Bates rallied NHS whistleblowers like sub-postmasters. So lots of people have been talking about the sub-postmasters and the drama. But this, in a way, well, this was worse, this scandal, because people died. So there is something we can do, Naomi. So first of all, tell me a little bit about yourself. I know you have a bit of a history in terms of your career and speaking out.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for inviting me on today. It's really great to meet you virtually and also to get the opportunity to talk about something that is so important. I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist. I was a very senior manager within the NHS, and I found myself coming up against the wrath of senior managers within the NHS for prioritising patient safety and staff safety over business contracts. Um, and now spend a lot of time supporting whistleblowers and also host a podcast where we've had quite a few whistleblowers on discussing their story. And it is a really common experience within the NHS. You know, I've come up against authority figures in the NHS on a number of occasions, and also know others who have personally.
So there was an important clip, Professor Jane Somerville, and it's interesting because I put it on TikTok and there was a huge demand for it, got a lot of views. Professor Jane Somerville says that it's NHS trust managers and they're not regulated. Could you tell me a little bit about that? So that clip from Jane Somerville's powerful. She's a big voice, you know, she's a big, trusted, respected voice. And you know, I've done a little bit again, like putting it out on the Facebook and the LinkedIn and etc. So what was Jane talking about in terms of these NHS trust managers? Tell us a little bit about that for anyone who
Yeah,
doesn't.
well, it's such, I mean, I saw the clip and it's very powerful, and she's using her voice in a really helpful, constructive way, but she's spot on. You know, most of the board members of very many trusts in the UK are not comprised of clinicians, they're comprised of people with totally different backgrounds. And of course, as a manager, people aren't regulated. So, as a doctor, a psychologist, a nurse, if we make a mistake, we'd be reported to our regulatory body. But actually, someone who's employed as chief exec, there is no way you can complain about the person too. So it's quite common practice for trusts to employ people who've perhaps failed in previous trusts. I've worked in places where we've known that the chief exec coming in has come from a trust which is in special measures because it's performed so poorly. So there's no consequences for people, and it actually makes it very difficult to raise a complaint about how you've been treated if the person who's treating you badly or bullying you potentially doesn't belong, isn't professionally regulated, because where do you go? All you can do is complain to their boss. And if they're right at the top, where does that leave you?
This is really interesting, isn't it? It could be any industry, but do you find difficult decisions have to be made sometimes? And you know, there is only so much money in the pot when it comes to the NHS, and maybe they're trying to stop awful stories from getting out because they're scared of how the public will react, and they'll lose faith and trust in the health system. Would that be the potential argument there? There has to
Well,
be a level of loyalty, and I know how difficult it must be to manage a large organization or a team when things go wrong. Um, how do you manage that?
I think undoubtedly finance is playing a part there. And in my own personal opinion, I've worked for the NHS for a very long time. And I think we saw a deterioration with the introduction of market forces, which actually meant then that the finance became a big issue. Most doctors, nurses, psychologists, they're joining the NHS because they want to care for people, they want to provide a high level of care. And so actually that is their biggest priority. And whereas managers, that isn't necessarily their motivating factor. You know, we've heard about people being recruited, you know, lured in on very, very well financed contracts. So it's not necessarily their biggest concern or priority. But I also think if you're not dealing with patients on a day-to-day basis, you know, sometimes people end up as doctors or nurses that are promoted to medical director or nursing director and having very little contact with patients. And I think people can lose sight of what it means to be delivering good quality clinical care if you're not doing that work on a daily basis. You know, David Boyle's book Tick Box explores the impact on the Windrush generation because the people making the policies weren't the people having to deal with the person at the end, you know, the real living human being that's on the impact on the receiving end of that policy. So finance definitely, you know, it's understandable that people do feel that the money has to go so far. But I also think there can be a lack of willingness to say we just can't do that because there isn't enough money. I've seen that not just in the NHS, but in other industries as well. And rather than talking honestly about what is possible within that budget, people try their hardest to make it work. And actually that really isn't helpful, because it does mean then that corners get cut. People aren't necessarily aware of all of the issues. But sadly, I don't think even that explains all of it. I think sometimes it's just that people are covering their own backs, so to speak. So they've made mistakes, they've made poor decisions, and they're just intent on covering up and supporting the person who's managing the problem maker, which is the person who's speaking up about patient safety, rather than I think seen as being a risk of bringing the trust into disrepute, because it becomes known about that there's been this area of poor practice. But actually, all of us should be thinking about people who speak up. What they're trying to do is protect the reputation of the trust. They're trying to say, here's a problem, let's do something about it. It's impossible to run a massive organisation like any NHS trust and for errors not to occur. But I think we need to get better at recognising errors are part of human nature, but actually let's try and do something about acknowledging them and learn from the mistake and then put it right. But instead what we see is covering up and covering up and covering up, and using more and more funds in order to do so.
Isn't that at the heart of it? And it could be any issue, absolutely. I was very interested in what happened in Hope to Le Gren, the children's home in Jersey. It was a completely different subject, but at the same time, it's like, why mistakes are made? Why can't we say sorry? It's difficult. This is a difficult situation. And it's been so interesting for me, Naomi, to see over the last sort of 2018, 19, 20, there was just disconnect. They thought cut the cover up culture. It's just wonderful, because I just don't think they're going to get away with it anymore. And do you know what I'm trying to say here? I mean, we've got to get better. So if you are a whistleblower, or what other terms could you use? I think you used a different term then. Whistleblower is not really maybe the right word to use, but say you've spoken up over something you've seen that you're worried about, concerned about, and you've lost your job and you've lost your career and you're struggling financially. What can you do on social media? What can you do to put pressure on these organizations so they'll turn around and say, we messed up here?
I think you're raising a really good question, Anna. I mean, firstly, probably just like to mention about the use of the phrase whistleblower. I personally don't like it, and I know lots of others don't, because I think whistleblower implies that people have gone to the press to resolve a problem. And in fact, the vast majority of people who speak up, they use in-house processes to do so. It's actually quite uncommon for people to go to the press, but I think what you see is people exhaust the in-house processes and don't get anywhere. Then they go to the regulator, and the regulatory bodies they lack bite, and often have quite incestuous relationships with the bodies that they're tasked with regulating. So, for instance, with the health service example, CQC members providing training to trust board members about how to pass a CQC inspection. We've seen, trusts they get a glowing inspection report, and then Panorama come in and reveal, that abuse is happening within there. So we can see that the regulatory bodies aren't working effectively either. And after, I suppose, people get angrier and angrier, and more and more upset about the injustice. So they
sign NDA, don't they? I mean, Jan Cruikshank, who I mentioned earlier, she didn't. She refused. She kept fighting. But carry on. So yes, there's all these different things that you go through internally. Then not everyone, like you say, goes to the press, and they go to the regulator.
They do, or they might pursue an employment tribunal, but actually less than 3% of people who pursue employment tribunals win their case. And there's also no documentation taken at employment tribunals, so all you've got is the judge's notes to use to appeal. So there's an unfairness within that system also. So people do take to social media and do become quite angry, and people really, what people want is justice. And you can see that in all these investigations and inquiries in the NHS. I think the NHS is fearful of being sued. So they're fearful of admitting to mistakes because they're frightened of the consequences of that. But actually, what it does is it just stokes the fire, because people, as human beings, we do have a need for justice. That's built into us. That's part, the evolutionary reasons why we want justice. And so people take to social media and post their story. But unfortunately, I think what can happen is that people who don't know very much about whistleblowing, never been in that situation themselves, often imagine that people who speak up are truculent troublemakers, if you like. Actually, that couldn't be further from the truth. The research shows that typically they're people who've been exemplary in their appraisals and their performance at work before encountering this difficulty that they're speaking up about. So they're not just truculent troublemakers, but unfortunately, if people aren't well versed in how to manage social media, they can just come across as really angry on social media, and then that can play into the hands of employers, because then the person looks like they're just angry and they've just not got their way about something.
That's the thing, isn't it? And I've seen so many wonderful, brave people speak out, and they've done it for the sake of others. But they get on Twitter, and you can see they're frustrated, and it almost Twitter becomes a form of therapy of dumping my pain. I mean, you're a psychologist. Do you feel some relief when you've got angry, or and then you can start getting into other campaigns that are maybe not even relevant because you just hate injustice. So you start getting that mentality of being the underdog instead of the victor. Instead of I am very proud of speaking up. I'm going to do something about it, and I now have the opportunity to do so. We've seen journalists do want to hear; they do. It's how I can help people with that. So what they just think, there'll be a cover up. The media organisations aren't interested. That's just not the case. I had so much interest when I sent out a press release about this conference last week. But yeah, do you think? Do you think that it's not just angry, is it? There's other mistakes people can make, not just getting angry.
Yes,
Do you know what I mean?
I think people become very fixated on the huge amount of detail, and so what you can find is that people are spewing out lots and lots of detail, which actually makes it really hard for people to understand their stories. And sometimes I've read people's posts on social media, and I know the stories is incredibly complex, and I understand why there's that need to try and but because the details are quite shocking if you get into the details. But actually, most people on social media are looking for sort of like quick fixes quick bites of information to be able to digest. And so if something requires a little bit more nuance, people will just scroll past it. And that isn't helpful, because actually, if you do want people to listen to your story, it's important to sort of stick to the point and have a brief snapshot of it. But you're right, people also get then caught up in the other people's injustice, and it becomes kind of calcified into people's identity as a whistleblower, which I actually don't think is very helpful either for our emotional health. I think it's important that we're not just caught up in wrongdoing and looking at the wrong side of society, but also, balancing that out with things that are much more nourishing. And it's hard to do that if your detectors are there for all of the injustice in society, because you could be reading from first thing in the morning to last thing at night, and you could be reading posts about injustices and how people have been harmed by big organizations.
Very, very good advice. And I would say, so when I approach Gordon Rayner from the Telegraph, you'll go, what's the headline? What's the top line? What's the story? So just a quick headline. And you really only need to put a statement out once, I would say. Really think about that statement and a very strong headline of who you are, what you stand up for. You can direct broadcast it through your own LinkedIn and your own Twitter. I think the other problem we have, some people go to unregulated alternative media channels, which I think are very damaging to one's reputation. I know during COVID, someone called Professor Martin Kaldorf spoke to a particular channel, and he was smeared for that by The Guardian. So, direct broadcasting from your own channels. And then you can spend a lot of time thinking, oh, I've got a comment or I've got a little bit of engagement on that post. But actually, it may be better just to pull back and to connect with organizations like yourself and people who've been through something similar, and to direct email people and just to get some advice and to build up an understanding of what you can do with wonderful organizations that are out there doing a lot of campaigning, understand media strategy in terms of maybe writing a press release to local media, contacting the media. These are things I can help with, writing press releases, for example, and how do you contact the media, and how do you, the thing is, the problem we have with the media is these, as a journalist, you go, that sounds a bit griefy. I don't know how much time I've got to look into that. It could be big trouble for me if I get this wrong. You know, we could be sued, the paper could be sued for libel. This, so if you're approaching a media organization where they have to churn out a lot of content and don't have a lot of time, so the Times and the Telegraph, the BBC, for example, have a lot more time to invest, and they have to make sure they're really, really careful before broadcasting. So if you get, there's certain media brands with a paywall, usually who've got a big investigation team, they're more likely to spend the time on this. So anyway, yeah, just churning out on, you know, the same story over and over again in a different way to quite a small audience usually is not a good use of time, I don't think.
I think you made a really good point there about, I suppose, choosing who you engage with as well, because I think Joe Public does tend to be quite wary of journalists. People are quite fearful of being taken out of context, made to sound as if they're saying something they're not saying. That's not my experience of journalists, I have to say. I think I've been lucky enough to meet so many that are full of integrity, and actually I've always felt that any contact, any opportunity I've had to put my voice out there has been it's been treated very respectfully. But I hear what you're saying about some of the other outlets that might be looking for kind of clickbait to have a quick story, and that really isn't in your interest because you don't want to be depicted as saying something you're not. And again, it kind of like potentially feeds into this idea that there's no smoke without fire, which is the thing that whistleblowers are often facing. You know, the idea that, well, actually, if they've been sacked or suspended, they must have done. And oh, I'm guilty of thinking that myself previously, years ago, about people before having had so much contact with people. But you know, the idea that, well, maybe they've done something wrong and I'm only hearing one side of the story. But actually, I think if you engage with trustworthy journalists with integrity, it gives the possibility for people to share their stories in ways that are true to the story.
Yeah, really good advice. And I wouldn't say that there are some journalists out there who I don't think handle things particularly well. A lot of alternative media, so-called journalists, they call themselves journalists or citizen journalists, and they could take your story, they could do an interview like this, and then just put a really completely inappropriate headline on it. And then you've fallen into this. This is a big thing, you know? And then it's like clickbait, or it's fear porn, or it's trying to cause outrage because they want people to watch, and they're hamming it up, spinning it up. And I know how to do it, guys. I know how to do it, but it's not the future. It's not healthy. It's not helpful. And scaring people and getting them to click. But I know we're in it's a level playing field. I've seen, like, for example, Wales Online, big media brands, the biggest, you know, alongside the BBC, for example, in Wales. I've seen them having to do clickbait because they're trying to stand out on Facebook, for example. So how you work, finding a good journalist is a real challenge. There are certain media brands that have a greater reputation than others, would you say? There are some good newer media brands coming through. But that's why I think it's actually quite safe just to broadcast directly yourself with a statement, say, for example, on LinkedIn or Twitter. But yes, because you want to get your story out there. And it's interesting, is if it's in some media brands like ITV and the BBC, people seem to take notice, and those naughty communications managers, yeah, that are trying to keep the story quiet, all of a sudden, oh, it's the BBC, so we're going to do something about it. It's so funny. Oh, it's now been turned into a drama, and everyone's in outrage. We're going to do something about it, you know. Oh, it's on Joe Rogan. We can ignore it. Isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting? You know, what about this channel? Well, what's got the clout? You know, how does a media brand have that clout to make people say, oh, actually, this is embarrassing. We need to do something about this cover up.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose the other thing I'd like to say there, Anna, as well, is, you know, there are some really good organisations providing support to whistleblowers. There is quite a strong sense of community. And I think, you know, you've got organisations like Justice for Whistleblowers and Perusia, based at York University, who do provide a lot of support, emotionally, but also will provide advice about good contacts in terms of lawyers, journalists, and so on. And so actually, if anybody is speaking up about something that's happened at work, whether that's in the NHS or any other setting, I would encourage people to make contacts with these organisations, liaise with other whistleblowers, be a bit sort of thoughtful about who and considered about who you're engaging with. But some of the organisations that are out there have got a really good history of providing support and backup, and they would be able to tell you their experience of particular journalists or particular organisations to liaise with.
Yeah, I think it's got to have power. I mean, so one article, this is the big thing I've experienced, is you may get an article in the Times or the Telegraph, and it's like really well written. It's really good journalism. But the problem may be then is that I know what the organisation will be thinking. They'll think, well, it'll go away, it'll be forgotten about. And that's the power now with what I'm doing and teaching people, is to keep the pressure up in a way that's very professional. So keeping up those videos and telling your story and connecting with the right people and doing it in a way that causes this embarrassment, that brings about that kind of tipping point, I guess, that this isn't going away. I mean, obviously, Jan Cruikshank, her story was on the front page of a national paper in Scotland. These things matter. Is working with those brands. I want to just mention something for anyone who's interested. This is not many people watch this BBC documentary. It was called Secrets of a $1 Trillion Island. And it was about the abuse of children in the Channel Islands, and how these two local bloggers, citizen journalists, really, they were hoping this horrific story of how they treated children at this children's home would just go away. But they kept up the pressure, and they really did make a difference. And the whole documentary really does talk about that at the end, is how important citizen journalism was, and how these people would not let it lie, and how they were able to bring about justice for the victims of child abuse in the island and compensation. So the citizen journalists played a huge role. It's about doing it well, isn't it? If we and also, about looking after your own mental health too. So you've spoken up, you may have suffered, you've got your message out there, but at the same time, you have to withdraw and get on with your life as well, don't you? Think, well, I did the right thing, but it can overwhelm you every day for years. And I've seen people on Twitter who've spoken out over their concerns during COVID, and it's still there for them 4 years later, and they're still talking about it over and over again. So I think it's also doing what you feel comfortable to do, and making sure that it's impactful and effective.
That's so right. And you're touching on moral injury there, really, Anna. I think, the motivation behind why most people speak up is the risk, is they don't want to be complicit with something that has a negative impact on somebody else. And in the NHS, that's potentially death or life-changing impact on the person's body or mental health. So, the reason why people speak up is often about trying to avoid that moral injury. But sadly, that often, when people have spoken up, if they're not been heard, they often feel that even though they've spoken up and suffered recrimination, that they still haven't been able to prevent whatever it is from happening. And that's a really heavy burden for people to live with.
So yeah, there's so much to talk about here. I mean, my approach, I guess, is in terms of how can we get that information out there now in this new media landscape that we're in with social media and other media. How do we make a difference? Because so many people go, oh, I saw the drama and it's headlines because the post. I didn't even watch it, the post office thing. I just didn't watch it, but everyone was talking about it. And it was the headline, and that they just kept trying to expose more and more of how this terrific thing happened, because it was a big drama. And I'm like, oh, guys, just watch that horrific stuff we did to kids in the Channel Islands. Have you not seen that BBC documentary? Because no one was talking about it. For me, what happened to children in the Channel Islands, with a children's home, was inspected for 20 years, and all the awful things that happened to children there. Oh, I don't know. There's so many stories, aren't there? It's just, how do we get the ones out there that, I guess it's feeling you are making a difference if you speak out. And I just think we're living in new exciting times. And we are all, we've all, this is the thing, this is what I would try to explain it, is like, Oh, I'm in the Telegraph. I was finally. There's been an article. Oh, no, let's find a way to keep that pressure up. There's a new ways of doing this. Um, we're all content creators, we're all got a chance to influence and impact the world around us on LinkedIn or on Twitter or on Facebook with real positive messages. Not, oh, I've failed. Oh, this is so sad. I've spoken out. This is so tragic. They're not listening to me. They're not listening to me. We've got to turn that around. It would have to have a winning feel. Does that make sense? A real winning feel.
Yeah, it does. I mean, often I think that's what people are looking for. They're looking for David and Goliath, aren't they? And they're hoping to have David's experience. And often that doesn't happen. Rarely, perhaps, does that happen. But there's something about actually, if you've done your best to get your story out in a clear way, actually you've made it more likely. There's more likelihood that you will have a David and Goliath experience, but also you also know you've done your best to draw attention to it. I think what's really interesting about the stories, I was just thinking about what you were saying about the post office as opposed to the Channel Island children. And I think stories become really vivid in the public's imagination when they can imagine themselves in their shoes. And I think what the post office drama did really well was enable the average person to think about what that would that be like if they were that person going to work and suffering that kind of injustice. And sadly, I think although the stories of children being abused is absolutely heartbreaking and should matter at least as much, I think for some people they will see that as that's not them. And that, I think that finding a way to make people realize that could be them, that could be their child, has to be a key part of the story to help the public want to see justice done, and you need the public on your side.
And that is really about really effective communication, isn't it? In terms of what's happened to me and telling it in a way that's so powerful. I watch some things and I never forget them. And they change society. You think, wow, there's a way of doing it, isn't there? There's a way of telling your story that makes people really identify with it and changes them and changes them. That's powerful. Listen, let's talk about your podcast and finish off because I know you're doing a lot of fantastic work and it'd be great to get some more people, more guests on, and more people watching and downloading it. Tell us a little bit about it.
Brilliant. Thanks for giving me the chance to talk about it. Yes, we're Locked Up Living, and we're focused on barriers to wellbeing in harsh organisations and ways to overcome them. Both myself and my co-host, David Jones, spent many years working in prisons and secure hospitals. So we have always been interested in the criminal justice system, but we've also featured justice for whistleblowers. We've featured Peter Duffy, who you might have seen on the news recently in the last week, because he's been speaking up about how he was recriminated against for raising concerns. We've also featured Eileen Chubb of Compassion in Care, really powerful episode that we shortly got coming an interview with Ian Foxley, who was the Airbus whistleblower, David Henke, who writes a lot of whistleblowers' stories. And this week we have a conversation being published on Wednesday, which is a conversation with Brian Richardson, and he researches the impact of whistleblowing on the families of whistleblowers. And I think that's a really important conversation because that doesn't get much airtime, and yet people who live with whistleblowers are also carrying a huge amount of strain, and they're often the only people that are providing support to the whistleblower. So please do listen, and if you enjoy it, please share it.
How fascinating. That sounds amazing. Yeah, I do really hope that people tune in. Is there anything I've not covered that you would like to say before we finish?
No, just I'm really grateful to you for giving me this opportunity to be heard, but also for the work that you're doing connecting people and making sure people are putting their stories out there, and also for the fact that you're offering people advice on how to do this, because I think telling those stories well is really, really important.
Media strategy is something I can help with, and I would urge anyone watching this to go and have a look at the National Union of Journalists. The Training Wales website has a lot of resources on defamation, so being very careful about what you can and can't say. In terms of covering anything that in employment tribunals, they also run fantastic courses on media law. So I try to signpost people to relevant and important information, because you've got to be incredibly careful, I think, if you're involved in making accusations against an organisation or an individual. You need to understand what you can and can't say within the confines of the law, especially if maybe you've signed an NDA and things like that. So the National Union of Journalists offer lots of advice and support and training. So I thought I'd just mention that as well. Lovely to talk to you, and I hope to stay in touch. Any news, do keep in touch with me, and I'll be happy to share it on my channels.
Thanks so much.
Well, all the best.